Is Kevin Durant actually going to get traded, and if so, where would he go? KD recently requested a trade, which was a shock to basically everybody, especially considering that Kyrie Irving already said that he would opt into his contract with Brooklyn. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports, I make opinionative NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. I also want to quickly mention that I recently started up an MMA channel, and if you guys are interested in that, the link will be in the description. But anyways, let's get into it. It's no secret that Kevin Durant is one of the best players in the NBA, and there certainly is an argument to be made that he's the best player in the league. The way that he's able to score on literally anybody in the league, including when the opposing team sends double or even triple teams at such a high level, is just crazy to watch. And it's also pretty clear that Kevin Durant is one of the best scorers in NBA history. But whenever a superstar player requests a trade, it's always somewhat shocking, but when a player of the magnitude of Kevin Durant requests a trade, it's really shocking. And it's just interesting to see what a player of the magnitude of Kevin Durant could potentially go for on the open market. Because obviously every single team in the NBA would love to have a player like Kevin Durant on their team, at least in terms of his skill set. So it is very interesting to see what kind of offers teams would throw at the Nets for KD. But now the question is, even though Kevin Durant did request a trade, would the Nets actually oblige him and trade him away? Now, over the past few years, it's been pretty clear that the players have a lot more power now than they did a few years ago, at least as superstar type guys. And more often than not, when these superstars request a trade, they do actually get traded. Recent examples of this is Anthony Davis when he got traded from the Pelicans to the Lakers, also Ben Simmons when he got traded from the Sixers to the Nets, and even James Harden, who was traded in that same deal when he got traded from the Nets to the Sixers. And the early indications are that the Nets are actually willing to work with Kevin Durant and find him a trade out of Brooklyn, but of course they want to get compensated very well for that. But at the end of the day, no matter what the Nets have said publicly, it's all up to them, and of course they could change their mind at any point. And if they end up making their minds that they want to keep Kevin Durant and they don't want to trade him whatsoever, they could easily just not trade away Kevin Durant, and KD would be forced to play for the Nets for the entirety of his contract. And something that KD could do at that point, if he really does not want to play for Brooklyn, is he could just hold out for an entire season and just bring up a bunch of problems for the Nets, and maybe the Nets would be somewhat forced to trade away KD at that point. But I just don't personally see KD holding out for an entire season. And although we definitely have seen a lot of superstar players get traded in the past, I think this is a much more difficult situation than even trading away a guy like James Harden or Anthony Davis, as obviously KD is a better player than both of those guys and would acquire a lot more assets in return. And I definitely don't see a deal getting done right away unless a team throws an absolute amazing offer at the Nets that the Nets can't refuse. But something that I could see happening with this KD situation is maybe something similar to the Ben Simmons situation, where KD probably would not hold out, at least I don't think, although that definitely is a possibility. But maybe what would happen is KD is playing during the regular season next year, while at the same time the Nets are looking for deals to trade KD out of Brooklyn, which would just turn into a very weird situation. But obviously Brooklyn is not just going to trade away KD for nothing. They're going to need to get a ton in return. And the fact that a guy like Rudy Gobert went for 3 unprotected first-round picks and an additional first-round pick on top of a couple of other players as well, which would just lead you to believe that KD would go for at the very least 4 or maybe even 5 unprotected first-round picks, including some swaps as well. In addition to, of course, really good players as well, maybe even all-star type guys. So the bottom line is, it's going to be very difficult to trade away Kevin Durant, and it might even require a 3-team trade. But now, let's just say for the sake of the video that the Nets are able to successfully trade Kevin Durant. If they were able to trade him away, what would some potential landing spots be that not only make sense for Kevin Durant, but would also make sense for the Nets in terms of the assets they would get in return? Now, the two teams that have been floated around out there are both the Phoenix Suns and the Miami Heat, and out of those two teams, I would probably say the Suns make more sense, at least from the Nets perspective, as DeAndre Ayton still hasn't signed with any team as of yet, which is kind of interesting to me personally. internationally, and he could potentially be involved in a deal that would bring Kevin Durant to Phoenix, alongside with, of course, a couple other players and a bunch of draft picks, obviously. But when you talk about the Miami Heat, there's been a report that came out saying that Kevin Durant wouldn't want to go to Miami unless they had their core of Kyle Lowry, Jimmy Butler, and Bam Adebayo. So from the Heat perspective, it's going to be pretty difficult to acquire Kevin Durant without trading any one of those three guys. So if none of those players were to get traded in a KD trade, I just find it very difficult to see how the Heat would be able to acquire him. Now, another team that has somewhat been reported in the KD trade saga is the Portland Trailblazers, but this hasn't necessarily been to anything hardcore from Kevin Durant's side. It's more so due to the fact that Damian Lillard posted something on a story of KD in a Portland Trailblazers jersey. So I don't know how realistic this is, and I personally don't think it's all that realistic. And although maybe the Blazers would have some picks to trade to the Nets, they don't necessarily have an all-star type guy to trade away, which is something the Nets said they wanted in return for Kevin Durant. So once again, that's probably another deal that would be very, very difficult to get done unless you add a third team into that deal, which would still be pretty difficult to get done either way. And also, KD's brother said that Kevin doesn't want to go to Portland. But if I had to pick a team around the NBA that would be most likely to trade for Kevin Durant, I would probably pick the Phoenix Suns, although I definitely don't think it's a slam dunk that KD does indeed get traded. As I mentioned, it's going to be very, very difficult to find a package that the Nets could get that they would feel comfortable trading a player like Kevin Durant away, while at the same time finding a suitor that Kevin Durant would actually want to play for. But the reason why I say the Phoenix Suns are probably the most likely if KD does get traded is KD obviously does want to go to Phoenix, as he did mention them on the list of teams that he wants to go to, while at the same time the Suns do have an asset in DeAndre Ayton that isn't necessarily an all-star type guy at this point, but he is ascending, and I would say he's very close to that point. And they could also trade away a couple other players and a bunch of first-round picks as well. And maybe you incorporate a third team into that deal where the Nets could acquire even more young talent or even more draft picks. But other than the Phoenix Suns at this point, maybe there are a couple other teams that may make sense, but I would probably say the Suns are the most likely team to acquire KD at this point if he does indeed get traded. But nonetheless, it is pretty clear that the Nets do have smart minds in their front office, and they're not just going to trade away Kevin Durant to make him happy. They obviously have to get a ton in return, and who knows, people's minds could change as time does go on. Maybe Kevin Durant changes his mind and wants to stay with the Nets long term. But one thing that I will say is it is going to be very interesting to see what happens with the Brooklyn Nets next year. Whether they end up keeping Kyrie Irving or moving on from him, or whether they end up keeping Kevin Durant or moving on from him. And the Nets definitely have to be one of the biggest what-if teams when they had Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and James Harden in a very, very long time. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Kevin Durant will get traded? And if he does get traded, where do you think he'll go? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy it, check one of these two videos popping up now. And until the next time, peace out, guys.